This morning and want to welcome all of you who have joined our community Bible study online. Some of you are on Facebook Live, others of you perhaps coming through the website. But whichever way you're joining us this morning, absolutely delighted that you're here as we continue in our study of this book of James. And I think I've said to you before, while I've read it many times, this is the first time to really dig in depth. And I said to Jane as we started this morning, I'm so grateful to be doing this with all of you over the summer because the book is absolutely just a powerhouse. So let's, before we pray, if you've got your notes there, all of you on Zoom have the notes? Yeah, okay, good. And I hope those of you who are online that you have them as well. But I want to refer to the introduction as we begin. And in that first paragraph, I point out three important dates. Now, maybe you're like I was how many of you remember taking history class in high school or college? Were you one of those people who said, I hate having to memorize dates? Well, I was one as well. But thankfully, as I have grown more mature, and more mature, for those of you who don't know, means half rotten. And so as I have matured, I've come to appreciate the significance of dates. And there are three very, very important ones good morning, Joan, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Good to see you.
Thank you. Yeah, if you'll mute. And then if you've got anything you want to say, just unmute and come in. But there's three very important dates for us to consider in the book of James. His letter was written sometime between 45 and 50 of the first century. And these are kind of like waypoints on a GPS device if you're on a hike or if you're going fishing. The second waypoint was Paul's encounter with the risen Christ on the Damascus Road. And that took place sometime around 35, about roughly 5 to 7 years after the resurrection of Christ. And then the final waypoint is the council at Jerusalem. And what year did that take place? Took place in 50. Well, connecting these three dates is important, and the reason why is because at the time that James was writing, the Jewish mission to the Gentile world, as we described it in the book of Acts, when we went through that together this season, that was taking place through the Apostle Paul. And at the time that James was writing, it was expanding and growing. Want to welcome Kay Fisher in on the Zoom. Good morning, Kay. And what was happening is that the number of Gentiles who were being included in God's family was increasing. But as the number of Gentiles increased, the other thing that increased, as we'll recall from the book of Acts, was the tension between the Jewish communities where Paul established these new, predominantly Gentile congregations. And so now James, during that same time, the Lord's brother, he was the recognized leader of the Jewish followers of Jesus from the time of Pentecost onward in the Jerusalem congregation. And if you'll remember, it was the pivotal Jerusalem Council that took place in about 50, where this tension between over the question, are Gentiles required to keep the law of Moses? That question was resolved by James' authoritative statement at the council in Jerusalem in 50. What's interesting is that in the book of James, have you found anywhere that he makes any mention of that council? The answer to that is no. So what we have to assume is that given those 3 dates, the Jerusalem Council has not yet taken place. So what that means is that the situation into which James is writing is one in which there are many questions about what life in Christ for Jewish followers of Jesus it looks like, and many of them were unresolved. So in his sending this letter out to these scattered congregations throughout the diaspora, good morning, Nancy.
Morning.
Want to welcome Nancy Broll to Zoom this morning. These questions were unresolved, and so as he's writing them, we've got to keep in mind that James has not had access in person to the Apostle Paul to engage in conversations about his teaching, nor has he likely read any of Paul's letters, because when you read the very first letter that Paul wrote, Galatians, it's obvious from that letter that Paul and James have met together. So we've got to assume that James is... Nancy, would you mute your mic there for us, please? Yeah. And so James' sources then, without Paul, Jane's kind enough to bring me some water. I'm going to take advantage of that. What 2 sources then are available to James to address these unresolved questions? Well, the first source are the scriptures that Paul writes about in 2 Timothy. All scripture is inspired by God. And my trick question that many of you have heard me ask too many times is, which version of the New Testament was he referring to? And the answer is the Hebrew scriptures. So James had the Hebrew scriptures to draw on, but he also had the teaching of what significant person, member of his family. That would be Jesus, his brother. And so as we go through James, as we're trying to understand what he's saying, we cannot go to the letters of Paul, because the letters of Paul don't figure in. If you do that, we can do it later by all means. But in trying to understand what James is writing in this letter, we can't go to those. We need to stay with the Hebrew scriptures and with the teaching of Jesus. So that's what we'll be doing together this morning. One other thing that I didn't put in the letter, I was thinking back early this morning over coffee and breakfast. I was invited to be in the all-state choir in Texas when I was in high school. And there were probably 300 of us who were part of this incredible choir. I remember being in Dallas, and we had some renowned conductor whose name I have forgotten many years ago. But what I will never forget, in his warming us up, one of the things he told us to do, he said, I want you to listen for the overtones. And we had 8-part harmonies as we would simply sing a chord, and you began to listen for these tones that were above all the tones that were being sung. Perhaps some of you have had that experience. Well, as I reviewed the notes that I wrote for this morning, I'm hearing overtones of Genesis 1 and 2. And we're going to be bringing these out as we go through the letter. So with that as a background, we want to dig in, but let's begin with a prayer, the prayer that we've prayed every week through the season, inviting the Lord to speak to us. So praying together. Lord, help us see you more clearly in order that we might love you more dearly and follow you more nearly, day by day. Amen. Okay, in the discover part, again, the first segment of James, which we've completed, there were 3 themes. The first one was testing produces joy. That was in verses 2 through 4. The second theme we talked about was wisdom coming through prayer, and we discussed doubt. That was in verses 5 through 8. And then last week we talked about poverty and wealth in verses 9 through 11. And now in the second half of the first chapter, we come to the second segment, and it's really like the unfolding of a great symphonic work. And each of the themes that are stated in those first three segments are now going to be restated in the next three segments. And so in verses 12 through 18, Jay, good morning. Welcome you. So in the first segment, the first section of this second segment or movement, guess what the theme is again in verses 12 through 18? It's testing. Next week, the theme is going to be that the wisdom that is gained through prayer needs to be applied through speech, which contains no anger. And that's in verses 19 through 21. And then finally, in that third section of the second segment, it's going to be that whether we're wealthy or not wealthy, obedience is part of obedience in our lives is practicing generosity. So that's where we're going in the next 3 weeks, okay? So as you read ahead. So here's the outline for the letter this morning. The first thing is that we experience blessings through testing and temptation, and that's going to be in verse 12. Then the second major point in James is that we cannot blame God when we fail the test or succumb to temptation. And that's going to be found in verses 13 through 15. And then finally, this segment closes with James saying that God is the source of all good gifts and that God is also the source of our faith in the gospel. So let's dig in and let's see. Christy, would you unmute and read the text of verse 12 to us, please? It's at the bottom of page 1 in your notes.
Oh, here we go.
Yep.
Blessed are those who persevere under trial, because when they have stood the test, they will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him.
Okay.
Could you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay. I don't know if those of you online were able to hear Christy or not, but I hope you're following along in the reading. And we're moving up to the top of page 2 in our notes now. Okay, the very first word is what? Blessed, okay? And the Greek term there is the term makarios. And the term makarios means to consider yourself fortunate. So I'm going to take another sip of water here. And so people who are blessed are also people who are what? They're fortunate. So let's go back and look at how makarios is used in the Hebrew Scriptures and in Jesus' teaching, because again, that's what James has to draw on. And so this word blessed, barakah in Hebrew, characterizes the numerous benefits of a life that's lived in relationship to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it can be synonymous with another English term, and that word is flourishing. Blessed is a good term, fortunate's a good term, and how many of us think flourishing is a good term? Yeah, that's what God's blessing brings to our lives. It means that we flourish. Let me read Jane, read Psalm 84, 4 and 5 and 12 for us.
Blessed are those who dwell in your house. They are ever praising you. Blessed are those whose strength is in you, whose hearts are set on pilgrimage. Lord Almighty, blessed are those who trust in you.
In those few verses from the Psalms, the word blessed is found 3 times, right? Blessed are those who dwell in your house. Blessed are those whose strength is in you. And the strength is experienced on the pilgrimage, on the journey. And likely in the Psalm, it was referring to a journey up to Jerusalem that people from all over the land of Israel would make. And then the people who are really blessed are people who have placed their trust in the Lord. Well, if you think about perhaps the most well-known of Jesus' teaching. Would you agree with me that it might be the Beatitudes? Yeah. Kate, put your camera down a little bit. I enjoy seeing the top of your windows there in the office. I think, oh no, that's maybe Nancy that I'm seeing. Yeah. Anyhow, yep, that's Nancy. I'm enjoying seeing the top of your windows, Nancy. There, there in your house. Yeah. So the Beatitudes, and it's interesting is that this word makarios is a theme that Jesus uses over and over in Matthew's gospel. We find it in Luke, we find it in Acts, we find it in Paul, we find it in Peter. It is this great Jewish theme that's carried into the New Testament. So, should it come as any big surprise to us then that James applies the word makarios to those Jewish followers of Jesus who are facing challenging times? No. Now, how many of us, when we're facing challenging times, the first word that comes to mind is, oh, aren't I fortunate? Oh, aren't I flourishing in the middle of these testing and trying times? And usually the answer to that question is, not so much. Well, one of the things that James will do for us, he will reframe how we see hard times. Because what is it he associates with them? Blessing, being fortunate, and flourishing. So, under what circumstances does James say that followers of Jesus ought to consider themselves fortunate? Going through trials, going through testing. As I'm looking at some of my friends' faces on Zoom this morning, I'm aware of some of the trials that some of you have walked through recently, different kinds of trials. It doesn't matter who you are. Trials, will they come into your life or maybe come into your life? It's inevitable, is it not? Remember what Jesus said, in the world you are going to have troubles. It's one of those inevitable realities. Well, so James, when he talks about people who are his Jewish followers in the first century, who are facing trials, and remember some of the trials they were facing were economic, because they were being marginalized within Jerusalem at this time. In fact, those trials were becoming so severe that they were experiencing famine. And Paul was having to take up a collection from the churches in Achaia to bring back to Jerusalem so that they might have the resources that they need to literally sustain their lives. It was a time where they were being persecuted by the religious leaders of the Jewish community. Early on, they were looked upon with favor, but not at this time. And so life was becoming a hardship, and to those Jews who were living out on the frontiers of the Roman Empire, they often found themselves in places that were predominantly populated by Roman citizens, often retired soldiers like Philippi in Greece. And they were oftentimes, especially the followers of Jesus, caught in the middle between the Jewish congregations in those towns and the Roman authorities. So it was not an easy period of time around 50 AD for these Jewish followers of Jesus. So he uses the term standing the test. And you'll recall from James 1:2 that the word for trial or testing is this Greek word. Now say it with me, okay? Parasmos. Repeat after me. Parasmos, okay? Now you've had your there'll be more 25-cent Greek lessons coming up this morning. But it's a hugely important word because it can describe two different things. It can describe external circumstances of adversity or the inner enticement to sin. And what did we say when we looked at it first? How can you decide which one of the meanings. It depends upon what? On context. And we're going to face that question as we go through this. Because in this opening verse now, let me ask the question, which of those two things do you think James is referring to when he's talking about standing the test and the trials? Do you think he's thinking about an inner enticement, or do you think he's referring to external circumstances of adversity? How many of you vote for number one, inner enticement? If you do, hold up one finger. How many of you are not voting? How many of us think it's number two, that external circumstances? I'm with all of you. That's what he's talking about now. And so what, in looking at the verse, back at the bottom of page 1, verse 12, what does God promise to those who persevere in those trials because of their love for him? What does he promise them?
Crown of life.
He promises them a crown of life. Okay, now, so where does this whole conversation come from? Moment, time out for water. Guess where the first reference would be in the Hebrew Scriptures? So, in the book of Proverbs, Laura, would you unmute yourself and read Proverbs 10:6, please? Whoa! Everybody else, please mute your button. Yeah, Jay or everybody, Nancy, Kay, yeah. Hit your mute button. Okay, turn it off, Laura. Not working so good. I'll read it for us. Blessings, what's the second word? They crown the head of the righteous. That's in Proverbs 10. And then in the prophet Isaiah, we read, this is the promise looking to the future time when the Jewish people will be restored in Jerusalem. And in Isaiah 35, we read, only the redeemed will walk there, and those the Lord rescued will return. They will enter Zion, with what? With singing, and what will crown their heads? Joy. Gladness and joy will overtake them, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. And so this notion of a crown is something that's deeply rooted in the Hebrew Scriptures. But then John, in the book of Revelation, in the 2nd chapter, the risen Christ, who appears to John in this great vision, there is a promise to this church in chapter 2 that if they will persevere, they will receive a crown. And Frank, would you read Revelation 2:10 there in the middle of page 2? Yeah, unmute, yeah. You didn't unmute, Frank. I'll read it. Okay. What does he say? Read it. There, you got it. Now, Frank. Yeah.
Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life.
Okay. Be faithful unto what?
Death.
Is that severe?
Pretty much.
Pretty much the definition of, is it not? Now, let's look at the development within verse 12. The development is that testing hopefully leads to what? Standing the test. And to people who stand the test, what does that lead to? Life. That leads to a crown of life. Now, here's my question. If you and I were members of that one of those first century scattered Jewish congregations made up of followers of Jesus, Jewish followers of Jesus, would you have found James' words encouraging? I think we probably would have. Hopefully it would have been something, have we all used that expression, it puts steel in your spine? You know what it means? Gives you the ability to stand up to something. Hopefully those words would be used by God's Spirit to put steel or resolve in our soul, right? Because of our love for God. It's not to be martyrs or because we enjoy suffering. It's rather that parasmos is part of what comes to the life of a follower of Jesus at this period of time. And we're given the strength to stand the test, which leads to life. But the reason we do is because of our love for the Lord, is in response to his love for us. So that's the first point in this segment. So let's dig into the second segment, and that is we cannot blame God when we fail the test or succumb to temptation. Did any of you ever buy life insurance before? If you did, go like this. Did the life insurance salesman start his presentation by saying, "If you die"? No. How did he start it? When you die, right? Please note that I said we can't blame God not if we fail the test, but what? When? Because the truth is, we are all, as we come to the end, all of us are in one way or another, we're all going to what? We're all going to fail the test at some time, which means we're all in good company with each other. So, Joan, would you unmute and read the text for us of verses 13 through 15, please? Follow along in your notes. Yeah.
When tempted, no one should say, "God is tempting me." For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each of you is tempted when you are dragged away by your own evil desire and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death.
For those of you moms where it says full grown, a better translation might be when it's come to full term. Okay? So, we saw in verse 12, we just emphasized that trials lead to standing the test, which lead to what? To life. Now, in these verses, there's another development. Distorted desire, what does that lead to? It leads to sin. And what does sin lead to? It leads to death. Well, here's my first overtone of Genesis 2. Do you remember that when Eve looked at the apple, and I'm not being one-sided here because her passive husband was standing there not uttering a word by her side who could have intervened at any point. So he was being, unfortunately, the typical passive male. But she looks at the apple, and what does she see? Oh, it's beautiful. It looks good, and I bet it will be sweeter than any golden delicious or Fuji apple that you have ever tasted when it's been put on ice. So, distorted desire in the garden, guess what? It's come into and has infected all of our DNA, has it not? Every one of us. So, now here's the question. Or a first question. Is desire in and of itself bad? I hope you're saying no. How many of you think the desire for food is a good desire? When I was up this morning, after I'd been up for a while, I said, I feel the need for an egg burrito. So I made myself an egg burrito. The desire for food is good, but sometimes it can get out of control. All of our desires that God has given us are good, but what does sin do to our desires? It distorts them all. And it's not the desire in and of itself that's bad, but it's the what? It is the distortion of the good desire. Now, here's another question. Have any of you ever struggled with blame, either as the subject? I see a lot of, maybe some of yours, and my poor wife is sitting over here behind me going, oh yeah, I've been the object of this boy's blame way too many times. Blame, if you look at the bottom of page 2, Blame is attributing to someone other than ourselves the responsibility for our action or reaction. In our marriage, Jane, if you just would have not done this, I would have been the perfect husband. So whose responsibility did I just make it for my actions? Yeah, hers. And who's the guilty party? It would be me. Now, what James is saying is that often, top of page 3 in your notes, when some of us fail the test or when we succumb to temptation, it's something that is said. What is it? Who's to blame? Well, God is. Obviously, God. And have any of you found yourself at times blaming God for a difficulty, a hardship that you've been in? Why would God allow something like this to happen to me? I'll never forget a conversation that I had with Jane's wonderful father when he was alive. Water moment. Her sister was diagnosed with breast cancer. And her dad, whose name was Frank, said to me over the phone, why would God let something like that happen to her? And my answer was, why not? Why not to any of us? God doesn't do these things to us. And when in those tough circumstances, we go, why would God allow my husband? We had dinner, I was telling Eleanor, why would God allow my husband to die of COVID? Dinner with a dear friend the other night. We asked, I'm sorry, Jane's trying to say something to me. I know she is. Yeah. And so over and over again, how many of us have said that at some time in our lives? Well, James roots this, saying don't do it, in the Hebrew Scriptures. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, it says, don't put the Lord your God to the test as you did at Massa. For those of you who have not read Exodus 17 lately, what you'll remember is that Moses has led the Israelites out of Egypt. They've been on the road for 6 or 7 days. They have not found either a McDonald's where they can get an Egg McMuffin, nor have they found a place to get water. And so they're looking to Moses, and they are not saying, Moses, we're so glad that you have led us out of bondage in Egypt, and we know that you know where God is going to provide water. Is that what they were saying? Absolutely not. If you read Exodus 17, they were grumbling, they were quarreling, they were blaming Moses, and Moses was saying, God, why did you pick me to lead these people? Here was their big question. Is the Lord among us or not? And what was their answer, more likely? Not. And this is where God told Moses, take your staff and strike the rock. And what came out of the rock? The water. And so oftentimes it's when we come to that moment of blaming God that God will demonstrate his faithfulness to us. He doesn't hold that over our heads, but he does want us to learn the lesson that he is not to blame for those challenges, those hard things that we're facing. Now, why does James say that God cannot bear responsibility for either our failing the test or our succumbing to temptation? Go back and look at the verses 13 through 15. The reason is it's the character of God. Can God be tempted by evil? What's the answer? No. Here's the second part of that. Does God tempt anyone to evil? What's the answer to that? Absolutely not. So we cannot blame God when we fail the test or succumb to temptation as though he is responsible for it. And when I was thinking about this, I thought of a prayer that his brother taught us. Maybe you've heard of it before. It's called the Lord's Prayer. Have you ever prayed it before? Do you remember that section of the prayer that said, lead us not what? Don't lead us into parasmos. So when we say it together next season in the chapel, hopefully when we're together in the cultural center, and you come to that phrase in the Lord's Prayer, you're going to be thinking, oh, he's talking about parasmos here. Don't lead us into temptation, but deliver us from what? Evil. So now, I think, maybe you'll agree with me, I think James has slipped over from the context into talking about parasmos as something that's an external circumstance, and now we're beginning to talk about the inner temptations that we face, the inclination to succumb. And I like the way that F.F. Bruce was probably the dean of Christian scholars in the 20th century. I like his translation of this phrase of the Lord's Prayer. Read it with me, would you? He writes and says it means, give us the necessary strength so that life's trials do not become for us occasions of spiritual temptation. Do you like that?
That's a good one.
I think that makes sense out of this ambiguous phrase from the Lord's Prayer. Lord, I need you to give me the necessary strength so that those trials or temptations that I will face, so that they don't become an occasion for a spiritual temptation prompted by evil. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So I think, as I say in the next point, he shifted now, thinking about parasmos as an inner temptation. And according to James, back in those verses, 13 through 15, at the bottom of page 2, according to James, who is responsible when we give in to temptation? He says very, very clearly, no one should say, God does not tempt anyone, but each of, what's the next word? You. So who does that mean is responsible for succumbing to temptation? Raise your hand. That would be each and every one of us. Each of you is tempted when you are dragged away by your own distorted desire, okay? And all of us, all of our desires, no matter how good we think we are distorted in some way. They drag us away. We're enticed by them. And then when they have come to full term, they give birth to sin, and sin then to death. Am I hearing another overtone of Genesis 2? That Eve was enticed, and finally she bit the hook. And what did she do? She took the bite of the apple, and passive guy standing next to her, she said, would you like some? He said, yeah, that looks good. He took his bite. We've all been paying the price ever since. Well, I'm happy to tell you that everything that James is saying here comes from fishing. Did you know that? What you can't see on my desk behind me is my... I put something out here.
Right here.
Oh, where? Yeah. What you can't see behind me on my desk is all of my fly tying materials. I love to tie flies to go fly fishing, and I brought one of my fly boxes. And when I open it up, it's full on both sides of flies. And I have lots of these fly boxes, Jane will tell you to her chagrin. And I also have lots of feathers to tie with. And every now and then, a dumb fish will be enticed by the fly that I throw out on the water. Now, a big, experienced fish is going to look at that fly and say, that is some poor, dumb tie flyer's fly, and I'm not remotely enticed by that. I'm just going to watch it go over and say, I'm going to wait for the real thing. Well, that is exactly what James is comparing all of this to. He says Satan is like a fly fisherman, a fly man, fly fisher man, fly fisher woman. And does Satan know what entices each and every one of us? Absolutely. Does he ever tire of trying to entice us to bite the hook? The answer should be absolutely not. And he will cast over and over. And by the way, if one kind of fly doesn't get it, you know what he'll do? He'll stand in the water and tie on a different one until he finds something that works on us. What do we learn when we fail the test? We learn, oh, he's used that kind of fly on me before, and I didn't like it when I bit it that time. I don't think I'll do it this time. And so what does he do? He comes along and he throws another kind of fly. And what do? I rise to it and I bite it again. And the Lord has to come, and he does not use barbless hooks either. It hurts to get them out of our mouth, okay? So that really is the metaphor that James uses to talk about this. And his teaching, when we don't resist strenuously, we become hooked. One of the important people that I've been reading in the last 6 months is a wonderful Christian psychiatrist from the Washington, D.C. area named Kurt Thompson. And I'd never heard about this before. It's called the Hebb's Axiom. And here's what the Hebb's Axiom means. Neurons that fire together in the brain wire together. And you go, oh, Bob, that's one of the greatest blessings I've ever had from a Bible study. What on earth are you talking about? Well, here's what it means. When you and I succumb to a temptation, or when we engage in a pattern of behavior that reflects distorted desire, what is going on in our brains, literally and physically, is we are creating neural pathways, because every time we repeat that sinful, distorted pattern, we are reinforcing this neural pathway. And the more it becomes reinforced, what becomes more difficult? Resisting the pattern. And the more and more that pattern begins to dominate our lives. That's why it's so important to recognize those patterns. And we become, it is easy then to have that pattern get established. And when it becomes established, it becomes deeply ingrained in us. And when it becomes deeply ingrained, is it easy to get rid of? What's the answer to the question? Absolutely not. There are some patterns in my life that have been there since my childhood, and I know that that's the part of the river of my life where Satan is going to cast his fly, because he knows how deeply entrenched in my mind that is. Thankfully, God's power can give us the ability to stand up to be able to resist. Now, much of what James teaches his congregations about temptation to sin comes from his brother Jesus. Now, Jesus says that, Jesus talks about who is responsible for our responses to parosmos. It's the same thing that James teaches. Who's responsible? You are, and I am. Let's see. Eleanor, would you unmute and read Mark 7:20-23 for us? They're about 2/3 of the way down page 3 in your notes.
Got it. He went on, what comes out of you is what defiles you. For from within, out of our hearts, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile you.
Wow. Yeah, Joan, I wish all of you could see Joan's reaction to this. How many of you really like that list? It's a tough list. Who said this? Jesus. And he said that all of these things exist where? In your heart and in mine. All of those things exist. And when they come out, the normal response that some of us will make is, oh, that's not me. To which we should reply, oh, really? No, that really is me. Because what comes out of us, according to Jesus, is what is in our what? That's what's in our hearts. We have good hearts, but our hearts are full of distorted desires, are they not? And so, should you and I be surprised when something like that comes out of yourself or out of each other? No. What is it revealing? It's just revealing what's in our heart. It's revealing what's really there. How many of you are surprised when these things happen, come out of you? Sometimes yes, sometimes not so. The more you know yourself, the more you're not at all surprised by what Jesus says. But now, here's what I also want us to come around to. The Bible teaches that all of this, each and every part, is common to our human condition. So when you look at each other, you go, oh man, does that Jay Holmes, I want you to know what's in his heart. Look at all of that stuff that it's full of, right? And Jay Holmes looks back at Bob Henley and goes, same back at you, big boy. It's true of all of us. But now here's something that I find absolutely incredible in this. Laura Lynn, would you read that text of 1 Corinthians 10:13, please? Yeah, unmute. Yeah, there you go.
No temptation, parasmos, has overtaken you except what is common to all of us. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Yeah.
So, no temptation has overtaken you except what? It's common. It's all of us face it. But God is faithful, and he will not let us be tempted beyond our limits. Are there times when you've sometimes wondered? Well, part of the benefit of temptation is learning your limits, right? Learning that, hey, I can't go there, because when I do, I succumb. I rise up to that fly, and I'm on the hook again for this. And so you learn that, and you learn that, okay, when I don't go beyond that, God makes a way of escape. He provides a way out so that I can escape the temptation? No, so that I can what? Endure it. And enduring is the same thing as passing the test, all the way back where we started in verse 12 this morning. So when I was a little child, I can't tell you how many times I was told, Bobby, don't stick your finger in an electric socket. Okay, guess what I had to do? Yeah, I had to go do it. And what did I learn? That's not fun. Don't do that. That's part of what we learn through this process of growing spiritually. We learn there are some things, no, I just can't do. I can't go there. And those things are different for each one of us. But because our brokenness, every one of us are broken in different ways, aren't we? Our pots are just all cracked differently. But each of us faces that same structure. And so the Lord will meet each of us and provide what each one of us need. Now, what do we do when we succumb? This is one of the greatest texts in all of Scripture. And let's see. Frank, let's try this again with you to unmute and read this text at the bottom of page 3 from 1 John.
What's the if we claim? Is that the one?
Yep, that's the one.
If we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just, and will forgive our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. If we claim we have not sinned, we make him out to be a liar, and his word is not in us. My dear children, I write this to you so that you will not sin. But if anybody does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous.
Carries over at the top of the next page.
Yeah, the righteous one.
Yeah.
He is the atoning sacrifice for your sins, and not only for ours, but also for the sins of the whole world.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah. Okay, here's another one of those lines of development. When we've sinned, first of all, if we claim to be without sin, what does the Scripture tell us we are? We're a liar, because we all confront this. We all face this. And he says the truth is not in us. Okay, but now get this line of development. Write this down. Confession, what does that lead to? That leads to forgiveness. And forgiveness leads to righteousness. And those three things come through the advocate that God has given us, and that advocate is no one other than his Son, Jesus Christ, who is the righteous one, who has made atonement for our sins. Atonement means his sacrifice has paid the price, and when he forgives us, he takes this relationship that's been broken, and it becomes at one again with God. And that at one-ment is repeated over and over again. So when we sin, the worst thing in the world to do is not deal with it. We need to confront it, confess it, so that we can be forgiven and made at one and continue to grow in our relationship with God. I know nearly all of us online have been parents. How many of you blamed your toddler when they stumbled and skinned their knee? You know, we just don't do that. And in the same way, God is a good, good Father, and he knows that we're growing, and he's patient with us when we blow it. And what he longs for more than anything else is to have our relationship with him renewed and restored through the advocate who's paid the price for our sin. And so when he says forgiven, and I try and bring it up again, what does God say? I don't know what you're talking about. It's been dealt with. It's been done. It's forgotten. Okay, top of page 4. We need to move on to the final point, and that is God is the source of all good gifts. And the text there, Joan, would you read that again at the top of page 4, verses 16 through 18, please? Yeah, unmute. Yeah.
I got it.
Got it.
Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created.
Thank you, Joan. Yeah. Can you hear any overtones when James says don't be deceived? Overtones of maybe Genesis 2? Exactly, the deception. What is, Jesus calls our enemy Satan, the devil. What is his chief tool? It's deception. It's that fly on the water, making us think it's something that we really want to partake of. When God, James says, does not send the parasmos, the temptation to evil, in contrast, what does he send? James says he sends every good and every perfect gift. Where do they come from? They come from above. It means they have their origins in God, who's dwelling. The triune God lives in this wonderful, eternal, triune community of love and creativity and joy and power. And those gifts come pouring out of heaven into our lives. And James calls God the Father of lights. Where did he get that? Again, out of the Hebrew Scriptures. Psalm 136. Jane, would you read that to us?
Yeah. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, who made the great lights. His love endures forever.
God made the great lights in creation. His love endures forever. Then Jane again, Jeremiah 31.
This is what the Lord says. He who appoints the sun to shine by day, who decrees the moon and starts to shine by night.
Stars, sorry, my typo.
Stars to shine by night. The Lord Almighty is his name. Only if these decrees vanish from my sight, declares the Lord, will the descendants of Israel ever cease to be a nation before me.
Okay, and so James is using the God as the creator of lights in the literal sense to talk about God being the source of light spiritually in our lives. What does James want us to understand when he says that the Lord, let me get to the right text, he does not change like shifting shadows? How many of you, if there are any skiers, the one thing you don't enjoy skiing in so much is flat light, because in flat light you can't see the terrain, and shadows give you this sense that, well, the light's shining over here one day, but today I'm not so sure. It's very mercurial. And he says God is not like that at all. God's not like shifting shadows. He tells us instead that he is, in that verse, the Father of heavenly lights who does not change. And then what did God choose to do? Please hear this. He chose, this is in the last part of verses 16 through 18, God chose. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth. And what that means is that the faith that you and I have, it's not something that we sat around and thought, oh, I think I'll become a person of faith today. Who gave birth to the faith that's in our lives? God did. It was really his work through a number of circumstances, but it was God who gave us birth. And this notion of giving birth suggests that when you have faith, you become not religious, but you become alive to God, alive spiritually. And then James says that we become a kind of first fruits. And I want to suggest that at this point in his letter, James is referring to those congregations of early Jewish followers of Jesus who have become a kind of first fruits of this church. His building is ultimately going to be composed of two groups of people, Jews and Gentiles. And out of the two together, this is my one time to refer to Paul, he is building one new humanity who find their whole identity in being God's family, God's great community. So I hope that all of this, for those of you watching live online or on Zoom, I hope that this will become God's encouraging word to any and all of us when we're facing parasmos, either as those distressing external circumstances that will come to our lives, not if, when, or we experience them as those enticing inner temptations that will come to our lives, not if, but when, and knowing that when we fail, we learn something about our own hearts. We learn what our limits are, but also in that experience of failing the test or succumbing to the temptation, we also learn how wide and deep and high and long is the grace of God that transcends our understanding, that we can never get to the bottom of. And so that if we fail the test or succumb to the temptation, we don't hide from each other or God, but we turn to him, and what do we find? Forgiveness and cleansing and restoring. So I hope you'll think about those questions that I've written for you at the bottom of page 4. Maybe talk about them among them yourselves, but I hope you'll also find them to be a very encouraging word as you go about your week next week. And look forward to gathering with you again next Wednesday morning, 10 o'clock Ocean Reef time. It's 8 o'clock here in the mountains of Idaho. God bless. Have a great week. Thanks for being part of the morning. See ya.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Bob.
You bet. Bye-bye.